I would like to thank the Federal Employment Service, Rostrud, and WAPES for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today and to try to contribute to addressing this topic. It's also a great pleasure to be in Moscow for the first time. It's a very, very interesting place. Unfortunately, I'm going to speak English and not Russian. My Russian is about 6 words, I think. Spasibo is thanks, I think. I've learned that. I'm learning the basic words first. I'd like to talk about then models of decentralization in public employment service. I have about 20 minutes to make some introductory remarks. That's more or less my task. And it's sort of a complex topic, and it's also rather difficult to pick out what to say. It's people in the audience have very different levels of background and information. And what I would like to do is try to just present an overview. Some points have been mentioned before, and to raise some issues as a basis for discussion. I won't try to answer the question of whether decentralized organizations are more efficient or better. I think Jan plans to address these issues in part. It's a difficult question to answer, especially to give a general answer to. No, I'm pushing the wrong button. How do I go for that? It seems like to me, in this kind of more philosophical or reflective presentation of the topic to start out with, it's important to consider what decentralization is, and then by inverse definition, what centralization is in public employment services. I think generally, I'd say it's a dilemma in looking at decentralization in public employment services. You want to reap the benefits of greater flexibility at the local level, and we'll talk about what some of those are in a minute, and you're familiar with those. On the other hand, you don't want to sacrifice a desired level of national coordination and maybe control, depending on the country. So you have to see the problem, I think, as a dilemma. And you have to try to achieve, in each context, a good balance. As was said before, there's no patent solution to where that would be. It depends on the context, the country, the goals of national employment policy, and the complex structure of institutions in a given country. It's probably worthwhile to think about, too, that there are background factors. Countries differ enormously. And decentralization has, for example, in larger countries, in more diverse countries, like Russia, or others too, probably the argument for decentralization is greater. It's impossible, I would assume, to efficiently run a large country in a highly centralized way or a national employment service. Other background factors that are important in each national context or situation are the quality of public administration and capabilities, especially capabilities at the regional and local level. That's an important prerequisite for decentralization or for the degree of decentralization. There's no centralization or decentralization. It's a matter of degrees and dimensions. And thirdly, I'd say the development of civil society, the capacity of civil society at the regional and local level for self-organization, which is a complex topic I won't go into, but that's an important prerequisite, I think, of decentralized actors and decentralized development of policies through and with the Public Employment Service. Take this. It's working now. In looking at decentralization, it's worthwhile, I think, to to open the black box. There's a tendency perhaps to see decentralization in global terms, but in practice, there are many different dimensions, certain basic dimensions of decentralization. In a recent project with the OECD, we developed sort of a series of questions to ask in local interviews to try to assess the degree of centralization in countries. One of the first questions is, how are the goals of the organization and its targets and its management system fixed? How much are they based on a dialogue process? Are they highly centralized? Or is there an incorporation of local goals and local targets? Another important dimension of decentralization in any organization, in this case the Public Employment Service, is the organization of service delivery and staffing. In some countries, Germany, for example, where I live and am from, the organization of the Public Employment Service is highly standardized. It's like a McDonald's or an IKEA. It looks the same no matter where you go in the country. It's also possible to allow much more variety in how local organization and practices are structured. Staffing is important. Is there local control over staffing? Discretion, for example, and even hiring people locally or outsourcing, deciding locally about outsourcing. Integration strategies, and to what extent is there decentralization and integration strategies throughout the country? Perhaps the most important would be, I would say, budget flexibility. In traditional public services, budget flexibility was very restricted. You tended to have line item budgets. In more flexible organizations and flexible public employment services, there's a great deal more flexibility. Germany, the German Public Employment Service, for example, although the organization is very rigid and standardized, budgets are flexible. Local offices get a global budget, and they can decide pretty much how to allocate their program budget to various programs and various focuses within the context of national planning about goals and targets. So how is money allocated? How flexible is it at the local level for local officials to use to develop their own strategies? Program flexibility is important. In many countries, pretty much in Germany, for example, there's a standard list of national programs, a menu. In some cases, local offices are required to do certain programs, whether they want to or not. But you can't allow flexibility. In Germany, for example, there's a menu of programs, and you can pretty much put your resources in whichever program you want within certain limitations and within the context of national goals. There's a great deal of flexibility about the choice of programs you emphasize to fit your local needs. On the other hand, in Germany, the programs are broadly defined, but pretty much set. You can't add new programs, so to speak, at the local level, or adapt existing programs to your needs very flexibly. You get into, it's a highly legalized system in that case, and flexibility then is limited. And target groups, eligibility criteria, another important element of flexibility. So in looking and talking about decentralization, you have to ask, what is decentralized? And a given country, I gave you some German examples, it might be decentralized on some dimensions, on other dimensions, fairly rigid. And in a given case, or in a process of decentralization, you have to ask what fits, so to speak, your country and your situation and your policies. Let's step back from that. We'll come back to that again later if there's time, though I'm worried about time. I always talk too long, unfortunately, but I'll stop. Generally, I think in terms of broad types or models of decentralization, as most of you would be aware, there are two broad types: managerial or administrative decentralization within a national public employment service. and political decentralization or devolution. The difference there is that in political decentralization, the local and often the regional units that implement policy in the regions and the localities are not part of the central public employment service, but are lower levels of government, whatever they might be in a given country. Provinces, municipalities, they're different forms. Managerial decentralization, I think, is important too. People usually refer to, in some of the literature I read from Wapes, referred especially to political decentralization, giving lower levels of government almost autonomy in administering policies. But historically, in public employment services, the first big step was to make national employment services more flexible and how they give discretion and flexibility to local levels. And that's a complex process. You're aware of how it works, I'm sure, from most European countries at least, have processes like this in which goals are defined centrally, quantitative targets are set for the national level, and in many cases for regional and local levels. There's a delegation of responsibility, operating units, the Public Employment Service itself, as well as regional and local offices, are told, in comparison with the classic public bureaucracy, more what to achieve, output goals, rather than how to achieve it. There's a much lower level of definition of processes in classic systems, at least. And finally, there's systematic monitoring and control. It requires a very comprehensive and good data system in the ideal type, at least, which doesn't, the ideal type, of course, doesn't exist in a great many European countries. So managerial decentralization is an important type, I think, in addition to political decentralization. And in fact, as I'll show you a chart in a minute, that's the most common type of decentralization in most employment services, and not political decentralization, most at least European employment services. Political decentralization is much more complicated and much more difficult, especially for a national office. As I have understood, the Russian Federation seems to have a form of political decentralization in its public employment service, in which regional and local provincial actors play a very autonomous role in implementing policies. And these systems are very complicated. There are a number of reasons for that and why it's more difficult that I can just point to. First of all, in politically decentralized systems, there's a greater diversity of interests. It's much more difficult for a central office to direct and control very diverse local actors in different parts of the country. The leverage, the possibility of direction are much more limited in the case of political decentralization, because the lower levels implementing policy are no longer offices of a common administration. They're separate political entities, often elected, and the situation is much more complicated. There's also typically, at least, where in political decentralization, a much greater variety of organizational forms in which local municipalities or regions or provinces often have different systems, different public employment services with different names. And it becomes a large problem to coordinate these in some way, to give it some kind of national stamp and focus. And finally, lower level managers in these organizations and operating staff are basically then, by definition, employees of other governments, other levels of governments, rather than part of a common system. They have a different organizational culture, usually, and are not subject to direct control and orders from central authorities. This is a very complex case, then. It has advantages and disadvantages, and I'm sure a lot of these will come out in the discussions in the next days. In terms of types, if you look at just European types, at least, or OECD types that I've looked at, obviously, federal systems often have political decentralization. Secondly, systems that have a strong degree of regionalization. Belgium, Italy, and Spain are the best examples I know of in Europe. And in these countries, the Public Employment Service has a different name in different regions, typically, and is run relatively independently. An interesting trend in recent years in some countries, and Jan will talk more about this, is municipalization, in which local municipalities are given primary responsibility by the central government for implementing local employment policies. And this is also then another interesting type of development. Denmark, Norway, and Poland are the examples that come to mind to me. Perhaps there are others I don't know about. This is kind of an overview I put together. It's about 2 years old. Maybe there have been some changes, but I don't think too many, about the types of decentralization in European public employment systems, the types of models. On the left, political decentralization. On the right, more managerial decentralization, whereby the extent to which MBO, management by objectives, is actually practiced in a rigorous way varies greatly. In some countries, it's a nomenclature, and in other countries, it's carried out in a very rigorous and systematic way. But it tends to be the language in which at least policy is formulated, in part because for many countries, the European Union and European social programs require this type of formulation of policy in terms of management by objectives. The reasons for decentralization I won't go into here, but they're very different. In some cases, for political decentralization. Often it has to do with regional differences or even conflicts. Belgium is the best example of that. In some cases, Belgium seems like it's 2 or more countries if you talk to the Public Employment Service in Belgium. And often there are 2 representatives or 3 from the Public Employment Service there who represent actually operatively different public employment services. That's the most extreme case. In Canada, it was quite similar. Quebec was pushing for independence, and there was a broad decentralization of public services in Canada, and the Public Employment Service was part of that process. The United States and others are more obvious. In some cases, policy reasons to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of policies play a role. But that's actually, my impression, that's often a subordinate role to other considerations. Often, changes in the whole system lead to changes in public employment services. The whole system tends to change for various reasons. Maybe by way of summary, we can come back and talk about benefits and risk of centralization and things to think about. I'm going to present this as open for decision. I'm not advocating decentralization, though actually I'm very sympathetic to decentralization. But there are also negative aspects and problems that any system might create. Perhaps the most important positive argument for decentralization is that, in contrast to centralized decision-making, totally centralized in employment policy and administration, local actors know better. They have better information and better knowledge of local circumstances, and therefore can serve best local needs and adapt programs and policies best to the local labor market. That's a very strong argument, I think. Critics are not always entirely convinced, or at least they would argue probably that familiarity of this sort with local circumstances doesn't always mean you have the capabilities and the resources to deal with local labor market problems and to formulate policy at the local level. local political leaders and local administrators might be less competent. I think the solution to that, if that's an argument that appeals to you, and that's a problem in many cases, is that any type of decentralization or program of decentralization has to be accompanied by a sense of and policies for capacity building. How do you develop the capacities of local administrators and actors in public employment services to be able to carry out new tasks? It's surely a mistake just to give them new tasks without giving them the capacities and capabilities of doing the type of analysis that they need and being fit enough as administrators to carry out complex programs and make decisions on their own. So these things have to go together. One thing that occurs to me, one example from Canada is, there are also examples of what you might call asymmetric decentralization. In Canada, the central government, over a period, devolved responsibility for the public employment service and labor market programs to the provinces, but not all at once. They bargained, so to speak, with each province, and if they wanted to take responsibility, they could. If they didn't want to, they didn't have to. And the federal government ran the programs in that province. So a kind of a more selective approach, instead of let's change the whole country at once, would be appropriate for many countries, perhaps even for Russia, from what little I know, because Russia is very large, and as I understand the federal system in Russia, I don't understand it, but it's very complicated, I've seen. There are about 83 or so units. It's an asymmetric process. The republics, the oblasts, the different parts of the country have a different standing in the Russian Federation and different responsibilities. And there is, in a large country, a much wider variety of capabilities at the local level. Tailor-made policies. It makes tailor-made policies possible at the local level. That's a strong argument. On the other hand, the problem that comes from that is you have everybody reinventing the wheel, right? New policies, innovative policies at the local level aren't always good. Innovation implies that some work and some don't. It has a downside as well as an upside. Obviously, you need and a problem of local variation in tailor-made policies, and a big problem in many countries is, do you have national standards? After all, usually a country wants to have, for all its citizens, a certain standard of services available. And decentralization implies, by definition, differences in standards of performance. And decentralization leads to much increased variety, not just in organization, but also in performance. I think that's a certain truth. One solution to that is to have minimum standards for all regional and local offices. And then there can be variations, so to speak, above these regional standards. Innovation and the problem of reinventing the wheel, and innovation has costs, experimental costs. The important thing there, I think, is that it would seem like to me and others to have some kind of system of collective learning, system of disseminating good practice, which should work well in most countries, as an approach to dealing with the negative aspects of too much innovation in a system or not knowing what to do. Sometimes, and I know cases of that, local offices and local are given much more discretion suddenly in what to do, and they don't know what to do, right? So they tend to do what they've been doing before until they develop new ideas, right? Innovation and flexibility, it's nice to say that, but you have to be able to cope with flexibility and innovation. And in many cases, that's not the case. Local accountability, I mean, it's usually argued that, which is from a management point of view, local people need identification with their programs and what they're administering. They have to believe in them, and they'll do them better. And local people know best what local people needs. But on the other hand, there could be a downside to this. As was mentioned, I think, in one of the introductory remarks, local interests can differ from national interests. An example from Germany, for example, the Public Employment Service, when there are no jobs for certain people, say skilled people in a certain area, the Public Employment Service will place them in another part of the country. They promote a national labor market. On the other hand, local actors, and even local and public employment services, if they're controlled by local actors, don't want to do that. They want to conserve skills in an area, and skills drains in depressed areas are a large problem. And so national interest and local interest diverge. Often, for example, German examples come to mind, but there are others too. Employment policy and employment subsidies can be used to help local businesses. That violates competition policy, right? The national perspective is to promote the whole economy and not to promote just the local economy. So there can be a conflict of interest, which you have to deal with. It's not wrong, it's just there, and you have to deal with it. And finally, a point that I think Jan probably will address more, overcoming policy silos, a problem that the OECD and its LEAD program have addressed. Employment policy is ultimately policy at the local level. Most labor markets are local labor markets. Employment policy has to be integrated with integration policy with local economic development in a country. You have to work together. The Public Employment Service has to work with other actors, local actors. That's often, experience shows, very difficult for highly centralized public employment services. If there's little local control about their budget, about their organization, about their personnel, it becomes very difficult to cooperate collectively with other local actors in a common policy. So I might just conclude, just a few minutes over, with some, okay, with some issues and challenges you might think about in your further discussions. I don't have the answers. I'm posing the questions. That's easier. How much central control is necessary and how it's best achieved? That's a question for any organization, right? All right, the need for local capabilities. How do you develop local capabilities and in the context of decentralization? How do you overcome fragmentation, which especially political decentralization leads to in organizations? And there are solutions to this in various countries, various types of national level conferences to try to deal with that problem. Yeah, to what extent our national services have to be standardized, and how much variation is acceptable? And finally, the problem of working with local actors. How do you maximize the capability of local and public employment service implementers, and they're still in most cases national organizations? How can they best be structured to work with and enabled, they have to be enabled too, to work with local actors in a cooperative context to develop labor market policy and labor market development and economic development at the local level. Thank you. I think I'll stop there, and I hope I've contributed some to the discussion.